August 13th, 1944. The kind of heat that made metal groan under the weight of the sun. Across the undulating fields of northern France, the air shimmered like water, and inside the steel hull of a Sherman tank, labeled number 47, the temperature gauge was nudging dangerously close to the red zone. Most tank crews had already pulled off the narrow roads, their engines steaming, radiators boiling over, men leaning out of hatches, gulping air as if it were their last breath. One by one, the Shermans ground to a halt, victims of relentless summer heat and mechanical exhaustion. But not this one. Sherman number 47 kept advancing, hour after hour, through swirling dust, exploding artillery, and fields set ablaze by shelling. Its engine roared without pause for 18 consecutive hours. No breaks, no cooldowns, no breakdowns. And the reason? A homemade cooling setup that had been the subject of ridicule for weeks. They had nicknamed him Icebox Jack, teased him for lugging around spare water containers, lengths of aluminum piping, and a chaotic tangle of duct tape and rubber seals. A gunner with a strange obsession, a man who never knew when to stop tinkering, until the day that strange obsession became the lifeline of an entire armored unit. While every other Sherman was succumbing to the scorching conditions, Jack's tank, crafted from scraps and sheer determination, kept rolling straight into the heart of enemy fire, never faltering. The laughter died the moment he became the last tank still in motion. Who was Icebox Jack? His real name was Sergeant Jack Morrison, though few in the 3rd Tank Battalion ever used it. To the men of Bravo Company, he was simply Sparky the soldier, who always had grease smeared across his fingers and some half-dismantled device resting in his lap. The kind of man who could fix a radio using only chewing gum or get a tank's turret to rotate by repurposing the crank from a field cooker. Before the war, Jack had worked as a civilian mechanic in Dayton, Ohio, specializing in crop dusters and delivery trucks. He wasn't college-educated, nor did he have the polished demeanor of an officer, but he possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of engines, not just how they operated, but what they required when pushed beyond their limits, when heat, stress, and time were all conspiring against survival. Drafted into the Army in 1942, Jack had requested service in the Air Corps, believing his experience with aircraft engines would be useful. The military, however, had different plans. They assigned him to a Sherman tank. The M4 Sherman was America's primary armored vehicle, a 30-ton machine powered by a Continental radial engine originally developed for planes. On paved roads, it could reach about 25 miles per hour, though its speed dropped significantly across the muddy, uneven terrain of rural France. Most models were armed with a 75mm cannon, carried a crew of 5, and came with a reputation for reliability on paper. In combat, especially during prolonged operations, with little time for maintenance, the Sherman had a fatal flaw. It overheated quickly. Once the engine reached critical temperature, it was finished. There was no simple restart. The lubricants would degrade, seals would deform, and within minutes, the entire drive system could lock up completely. Jack respected the tank, but he didn't trust its stock cooling system. He began experimenting early, making small modifications, adding a vent here, installing an extra fan there. But by mid-1944, his tank looked less like a military vehicle and more like a mobile science experiment. He had constructed an auxiliary cooling loop using salvaged aircraft components, mostly aluminum tubing pulled from wreckage, along with a repurposed water tank mounted beside the exhaust outlet. A toggle switch beside his seat operated a jury-rigged pump that circulated coolant through a secondary radiator he had concealed behind the side armor. It looked absurd. His platoon leader, Lieutenant Robert Hawkins, described it as a plumber's worst nightmare. The other tankers mocked it daily, asking Jack if he planned to open a lemonade stand on the front lines. But Jack didn't care. He wasn't building it for admiration. He was building it because he understood something most of his comrades didn't. Once the invasion of France began, there would be no rest stops, no time for repairs. They would be driving hard and long, and if your engine failed deep in enemy territory, you wouldn't get a second chance. He remembered what had happened to his cousin in Sicily, killed inside a motionless tank, trapped during an ambush, burned alive before the crew could evacuate. Every time someone laughed, Jack would simply nod and say the same thing: "When the time comes, I'd rather be moving." He didn't know exactly when that moment would arrive, but it did. And when it did, Jack Morrison's so-called foolish contraption became the only barrier between his company and total disaster. The mockery and the machine. It began with a leak. Jack had just completed a 30-mile maneuver through the bocage, those dense, overgrown hedgerows that transformed Normandy into a maze of ambushes and choke points. His Sherman 47 was emitting a strange hissing sound from the rear, not the usual mechanical whine, but a thermal release. He opened the hatch and crawled back, crouching low to avoid stray bullets as gunfire echoed in the distance. The back of the tank was scalding hot. Steam poured from the radiator cap. The coolant had boiled over again. While the rest of the company cleaned their weapons or wrote letters home at the bivouac, Jack was underneath the tank, hands blackened with grime, tightening clamps and replacing corroded lines. That night, he had an idea, one so bold it seemed reckless. He began assembling an external cooling loop, a secondary system designed to offload heat from the engine without relying solely on the factory-installed radiator. He scavenged aluminum tubing from wrecked aircraft, welded a support bracket to the tank's side, and installed a salvaged auxiliary fuel pump to circulate water through his network. He connected a spare jerrycan as a backup coolant reservoir and built a makeshift overflow chamber from an old ammunition crate. The result was bizarre. Pipes twisted through the engine compartment like metallic vines. The tank's silhouette now bore an unusual bulge, and the pump emitted a faint, grating hum, like a malfunctioning coffee grinder. When he first activated it, the water pressure caused a line to burst clean off. His loader, Private Conway, laughed so hard he nearly tumbled from the turret. The rest of Bravo Company joined in, dubbing it Jack's Moonshine Rig, or the Silver Serpent. One gunner sketched a cartoon of it on the mess hall chalkboard, complete with steam plumes and a geyser erupting from the turret. Jack remained unfazed. He quietly rebuilt the system, this time reinforcing the joints with rubber insulation stripped from aircraft wiring. He added a small filter to catch debris and upgraded the pump to handle higher flow rates. He even mounted a thermometer directly onto the secondary tank to monitor the temperature difference between the input and output lines. And still, the jokes persisted. Lieutenant Hawkins, his platoon commander, tried to be diplomatic. "Morrison, I admire your enthusiasm," he said one afternoon, arms folded, eyebrows arched. "But this isn't a laboratory. If that thing ruptures mid-battle and sprays boiling coolant into your loader's face, I'll be writing a letter to his mother." Jack nodded. "Understood, sir." But he didn't stop, because while others laughed, Jack watched the temperature gauges, and they told him a different story. His engine was running cooler, 5 degrees lower than average. On hotter days, nearly 15 degrees below the other Shermans in his unit. That was the difference between life and death. Sherman engines, particularly the radial R975 models, were notorious for retaining heat under sustained load. Designed for airflow at high altitudes, they struggled in confined spaces and dense landscapes. Prolonged overheating damaged seals, weakened bearings, and reduced power output. Worse, a hot engine emitted a distinct thermal signature that German tank hunters could easily detect. Jack knew this. The men mocking him? They didn't. They hadn't studied the engine schematics during downtime. They hadn't memorized the service manual. They didn't hear what Jack heard, the subtle shift in engine pitch that signaled an imminent seizure. He heard it daily, so he worked alone. By the time August arrived, his cooling system was fully functional. Jack had logged over 30 hours of operation in training scenarios, with no failures, no leaks, no explosions, but still, no recognition. And then came the order, a rapid advance across 30 miles of occupied territory. No resupply for 24 hours, minimal support, a swift armored assault, heat, dust, and endless hours in full gear. This was the scenario Jack had prepared for, but no one realized it yet. To them, it was just that odd-looking tank with the plumbing issue. What they failed to understand was that Jack Morrison's so-called flaw was about to become their only hope. The march into hell, August 13th. The briefing was brief and grim. Bravo Company was to depart at 0400 hours. Their objective, a strategic crossroads near the village of Saint-Benoît, deep within enemy-controlled land. German resistance was expected. No air support, no armored reinforcements, no guarantee of fuel or water for at least 20 hours. It was the type of operation that looked straightforward on a map, but descended into chaos, blood, and molten steel once boots hit the ground. The landscape was brutal: miles of thick hedges, narrow dirt paths, and dry farmland dissected by stone walls and ditches. Worse, temperatures had hovered above 90 degrees Fahrenheit for days, with no relief in sight. Inside the tanks, conditions were even worse. A sealed Sherman under load could reach internal temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel hull became a griddle, air stagnated, sweat soaked through uniforms within minutes, moisture evaporated from the engine deck, leaving behind a haze of steam. At morning roll call, tension was palpable. Crews taped loose wires, inspected radiators, and silently prayed their engines would survive the journey. Every tanker knew the consequences of a breakdown in hostile territory. More than a mechanical failure, it was a death sentence. Jack Morrison stood beside Sherman 47, tightening bolts on his external cooling pump. The aluminum tubing caught the early light. A thin wisp of steam curled from the exhaust. His crew was anxious, but Jack was calm. "Morning, icebox," someone called. "Don't forget your garden hose." Laughter spread through the group. Jack said nothing. He finished securing the final clamp, climbed to his hatch, reached down to the control panel, and flipped the switch that activated his auxiliary loop. A low hum began the sound of circulation, of water flowing, of survival. They rolled out at 4:30 a.m. Initially, all went smoothly. Engines warmed, tracks clattered, tanks advanced in staggered formation. The air carried the scent of dry grass and diesel. Crews remained silent, eyes scanning the tree lines, hands near triggers. But within 90 minutes, issues arose. Tank 39, the lead reported engine trouble, then 42, then 49. 3 Shermans in the first platoon began falling behind. Temperature gauges climbed, engines sputtered, radiators vented steam. One had to pull over completely. The commander's voice crackled over the radio. 42 redlining. Can't maintain speed. 49. Losing pressure. Limping at 50%. Request maintenance halt. But there was no time. They were on a strict timeline. Every minute wasted allowed the enemy to strengthen their defenses. Jack glanced at his own dashboard. 98 degrees Fahrenheit stable. No alerts. The coolant reservoir still half full. The loop functioning perfectly. The platoon pushed deeper into the countryside. Roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, then mud. The sun rose, baking the earth into cracked clay. Dust swirled with every turn of the treads. Visibility dropped. Tanks advanced through a haze of heat and brown fog. Then came the ambush. Concealed in a barn and behind a hedgerow, German anti-tank gunners opened fire. The first shell struck Tank 44 squarely, shearing off its turret ring. A second round hit the rear of 46, crippling its drivetrain. Black smoke billowed into the sky. Crews scrambled from hatches, dragging wounded comrades, shouting for cover. The column halted. Engines idled at high heat. Radios blared. Time slipped away. Lieutenant Hawkins barked into the radio, "Move forward! For God's sake, get eyes on that ridge! We're sitting targets!" But the Shermans weren't responding. One by one, the remaining tanks were overheating. Warning lights flashed. Fluid levels dropped. Hatches opened as crews tried to dissipate heat with rags and canteens, except for one. Sherman 47. Jack keyed his microphone. 47 operational, pushing left flank. A pause. Then Hawkins. 47. Are you insane? That ridge is under fire. Jack peered through his periscope. The world ahead shimmered with heat waves and gun smoke. He spotted muzzle flashes through the hedge, but his engine remained steady. His auxiliary system was working. "Better me than a dead engine, sir," he replied. With that, 47 surged forward, kicking up dust and debris, treads biting into the dry soil. Machine gun rounds pinged off the hull. Jack's driver shifted gears sharply, veering into a wide arc that flanked the burning barn. In the distance, a German pack anti-tank gun rotated. Jack aligned the 75mm cannon and fired. A direct hit, the German crew scattered. The left flank was clear. Over the radio, enemy gun neutralized. 47 still mobile. Inside the tank, it was a sauna. Sweat poured down faces. Breaths came in gasps. But the temperature gauge held at 102 degrees Fahrenheit, no higher. The coolant flowed. The system endured. Jack Morrison's absurd plumbing project had just prevented the entire column from collapsing. But the fight wasn't over. Miles remained. Heat still threatened the collapse of the line. One tank keeps going. By midday, Bravo Company's advance had slowed to a crawl. What began as a swift armored push had become a graveyard of machinery. 4 of the 9 Shermans were out of action. 2 had thrown tracks on muddy slopes. 1 had ruptured a coolant line. Another had stalled completely and was being stripped for parts. Tank 39 had towed 46 off the road using a makeshift chain. Tank 42 was bleeding steam from its engine deck like a wounded whale. Radio chatter grew desperate. "We're cooked out here, sir. No airflow. Engine bay glowing. Radiators screaming. Can't push another mile." Lieutenant Hawkins was furious but powerless. He knew what these reports meant. They had driven too hard, too fast, in weather that could melt metal. German forces were regrouping near the crossroads. If they stopped now, the enemy would fortify and attack from the ridgelines. Battalion HQ issued a direct order. The objective must be secured by 1800 hours. No delays permitted. But they were stalled except for 1 tank. Sherman 47 was still running, still advancing, still hot, but not overheating. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating. Sweat dripped from the crew's faces, soaking shirts, pooling in gloves. The metal beneath them vibrated with strain, yet held firm. Jack studied his dashboard. 99 degrees Fahrenheit, pressure stable, coolant circulating. The auxiliary pump hummed smoothly. The aluminum tubes coiled through the engine bay, drawing heat into the external reservoir, where it dissipated into the dry French air. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. He checked the rubber seals for leaks. Nothing. Only the quiet drone of a system everyone had once dismissed, now outperforming anything General Motors had ever designed. Outside, chaos reigned. Tanks parked along ditches, crews stripped to the waist, working with tools and rags, dousing engines with water, cursing through clenched teeth. Some sat atop turrets, defeated, helmets off, heads in their hands. "Jack, how the hell is your rig still moving?" Conway shouted from the loader's hatch, squinting into the sun. Jack didn't respond. He was watching the tree line, where smoke curled and shadows shifted. Hawkins crackled over the radio. 47? Status? Jack keyed the mic. "Full mobility. I can scout ahead." "Negative?" Hawkins replied. "You go alone. You'll draw fire without support." Jack looked at his crew. They were exhausted, collars open, eyes bloodshot, hands blistered from heat, but none hesitated. They understood the danger. They also knew they were the only ones still rolling. "We'll draw fire," Jack said calmly, "but we'll also draw attention." A pause. Then, "Proceed at your discretion. Don't get killed." Jack allowed himself a faint smile. "Copy that." Sherman 47 rolled forward, slow at first, then accelerating, gravel flying as it passed the stalled column. The other crews stared in disbelief as the odd, jury-rigged machine with its external pipes and ammo can reservoir rumbled past like a spectre. The tank hit 30 miles per hour on a straight stretch, engine screaming. Jack's driver, Private Ames, clenched his jaw and held course. Conway loaded high-explosive shells. The gunner targeted the orchard ahead, where a German anti-tank position had been reported. Then it came. A shell cracked through the air, striking 10 yards to the left. Another whistled overhead. Return fire erupted from the hedge. The Germans were ready but unprepared for a tank that wouldn't stop. Jack aligned the 75mm, fired. A direct hit ignited the orchard. Ammunition cooked off in a series of small explosions. Conway reloaded. Another shot. Second gun silenced. They pressed on for 2 more hours. 47. Advanced without pause, through shattered farmland, through ambushes, through shell bursts and rifle fire. The tank never cooled, never paused, never failed. By 1600 hours, they reached the objective alone. A single Sherman parked beneath a collapsed barn roof, engine humming like a lullaby, heat still radiating from the hull, but alive. Operational. Mission complete. 10 minutes later, the rest of Bravo Company limped in behind them. The battle was won, the position secured, the ridge now theirs, and at the heart of it all stood one absurdly patched-together cooling system that had kept a tank running for 18 hours straight, 18 hours in hell, without a single mechanical failure. Jack climbed down, drenched in sweat, boots caked in dust, goggles fogged. Someone handed him a canteen. "Still think it's stupid?" he asked, scanning the group. No one answered. They didn't need to. The dust hadn't settled before questions began. Sherman 47 stood alone beneath a scorched oak tree near the crossroads. engine still ticking from residual heat. Around it, men from Bravo Company moved slowly, bodies stiff, boots dragging through cracked earth. A few tanks were still being towed into place. One had been abandoned, its track broken, hull leaking fluid now home to flies and regret. But 47? Still operational. Hawkins approached first. He said nothing at first, just stared up at the aluminum tubing, the water-stained ammo box bolted to the hull, the faintly humming pump. He removed his helmet, ran a hand through sweat-matted hair, and exhaled deeply. Jack stood on the hull, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon. "I owe you an apology," Hawkins said finally. Jack didn't move. "For what? For thinking that strange little device was just a waste of time?" the lieutenant replied. "Turns out, it was the only reason we made it here with anything left to fight." Silence. Then Jack stepped down, boots meeting the ground with a soft thud. "It wasn't about being right," he said. "It was about not dying." The next hour blurred into repairs and debriefs. Radio messages reported enemy retreat, medics tended the wounded, mechanics evaluated which Shermans could be salvaged, which would be dismantled. But wherever Jack went, eyes followed. The men who had once mocked the icebox now looked at his rig with quiet reverence. No more laughter, no more cartoons, just the clink of wrenches, the relay of orders, and the occasional whisper, "That thing saved us." Some even asked questions. "What kind of pump is that? Where did you get the tubing? Did it really run 18 hours straight?" Jack answered with brief nods and single words. He wasn't after fame, but deep down, he felt a quiet vindication, not because he had been smarter, but because his creation had worked when everything else failed. That night, something changed. As the sun dipped below the tree line and the air cooled for the first time all day, the crews gathered around a fire built from ammunition crates and dry brush. Someone passed around a tin of coffee, lukewarm, gritty, but welcome. Jack sat on a folding stool, sleeves rolled, arms scraped and stained with grease. Conway leaned over. "They're talking about sending a report up the chain. Might want to patent that damn thing." Jack smirked. "Don't think the army gives medals for duct tape and radiator fluid." But it wasn't a joke anymore. The next morning, Lieutenant Hawkins summoned him. A captain from Battalion HQ had arrived. Word had spread about the Sherman that wouldn't die. There were inquiries about the design, how it was built, how it could be replicated. Jack provided everything. Measurements, flow rates, materials, field conditions, maintenance tips. They took detailed notes. That afternoon, 3 other tanks in Bravo Company began installing modified versions of the system-scavenged tubing, repurposed jeep pumps, spare water jugs turned into makeshift cooling loops. Jack moved between them quietly, offering advice, helping where needed, never uttering, "I told you so," because he didn't need to. Respect had already arrived, not through medals, but through the slow, reluctant acknowledgement of men who had learned a lesson the hard way. Sometimes the solution isn't in the manual. Sometimes it comes from the man you laughed at. Legacy in steel and sweat. Within a week, nearly half of Bravo Company had some version of Jack's cooling system fitted to their tanks. Some were clean, neatly bent copper tubing, shielded valves, recycled oil drums, sliced into water basins. Others were crude, barely held together with wire and hope. But they worked. And that was all that mattered. The impact was immediate. During the next advance, fewer tanks stalled. Maintenance teams faced fewer emergencies. One platoon achieved a record 40-mile push through the French interior without a single engine failure. In a war where every inch of progress cost lives and metal, that was no small achievement. Word traveled. Jack never saw an official commendation or a promotion, but he noticed a shift in how officers addressed him: more direct, more respectful, not with awe, but with recognition. They no longer saw him as the tinkerer. They saw him as a problem solver. And it wasn't just about heat. It was about trust that a regular enlisted man, a mechanic from Ohio, could identify a flaw in military hardware and fix it before anyone in logistics had even noticed it existed. At night, the crews stopped mocking the icebox. They began inspecting it, measuring pipe diameters, asking about pump speeds and thermal retention. Mechanics took notes. Engineers made sketches. Though it never entered any formal technical manual, Jack's design quietly influenced dozens of tank crews across the 4th Armored Division. One sergeant even attempted a dual tank cooling exchange, linking coolant between 2 Shermans like twin hearts. It failed, But no one laughed. The lesson had been learned. Ingenuity mattered. Improvisation wasn't weakness. It was survival. Jack's crew never needed a second system. The original held through 3 more campaigns: France, Luxembourg, and into the forests of Belgium. It was never replaced, only cleaned, adjusted, and kept running like a heartbeat. It became an unspoken symbol of the idea that small changes, even crude ones, could shift the balance. That war wasn't just about tanks and tactics, but about adaptation, the kind born from frustration, sweat, and a refusal to accept good enough. Back home, Jack Morrison's name would never appear in newspapers, speeches, or history books. But the men of Bravo Company remembered. They remembered who kept them moving when the machines were ready to break. And for every soldier who reached the next village, the next hill, the next bridge, because their engine didn't fail, there was a trace of Jack's ingenuity in that machine. It wasn't polished. It wasn't official, but it was real. And in war, that's what matters most. They called it the stupid cooling system until it wasn't. Until it was the only thing standing between a failed mission and a victory that kept the line advancing. Until it became the quiet difference between life and death. Jack never wore medals for what he built. He never rose in rank because of it. He never gave interviews, never patented a thing. When the war ended, he packed his duffel, shipped back to Ohio, and returned to the same dusty garage where he'd once fixed delivery trucks and crop dusters. He lived quietly, married, raised children, repaired cars, never spoke of Normandy unless someone asked. But those who fought beside him remembered. Because in the chaos of war where steel grinds against steel and human endurance is pushed to the limit, it's easy to believe victory comes from above, from generals, plans, firepower. But more often, it comes from below, from the hands of someone who refuses to accept the system's limits. From the stubborn mind of a mechanic who looks at a failing machine and says, "Not today." From a man mocked, ignored, and dismissed until the moment everything is on the line. And when that moment comes, the war doesn't care about rank, titles, or hierarchy. It cares about who still moves when the rest have stopped. Jack moved. His engine moved. And because of that, so did his brothers in arms. That's the true machinery of war. Not just tanks, planes, or bombs, but the minds willing to reimagine them, repair them, and push them beyond their intended design. So here's the truth. What seems like nonsense today might save your life tomorrow. What they laugh at in the barracks might be what brings them home. And sometimes, the most absurd idea in the room, wrapped in duct tape and aluminum, just needs time to prove itself. Jack didn't win the war, but for 18 hours, he kept it moving. And for the men around him, that was everything. What part of Jack's story hit you the hardest? Have you ever seen someone ridiculed for an idea until it worked? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe ingenuity still matters, like it did in that Sherman on August 13th, 1944, hit like, subscribe, and share this story. Let's keep these forgotten sparks of history alive.